Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. This is Stephen Bishop, and today our topic is perception. What would happen if everything we sensed made its way into our brain? Everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you smelled, everything you tasted, even the clothes on your back, or the rumbling in your stomach. If all those things made its way into your brain and you had to attend to everything, you would soon go crazy. Luckily, that's not what happens. We can choose what we're going to pay attention to. This phenomenon is called selective attention. We can explain this by the model of figure-ground relationships. If you look at the picture on the left, you see a vase. The vase is in yellow. Everything else in black just fades into the ground. But you can decide what you're going to pay attention to. What if you paid attention to the figures in black? Then you see two faces looking at each other, and the yellow background fades away as ground. Not only do we have figure-ground relationships in things we see, we also have the same phenomena in our hearing. For instance, if you're in a restaurant or at a cocktail party, there's sound going all around you. But you can pay attention to the voice or the conversation with the person you're talking to. That becomes your figure. All the other sounds and conversations in the background now become the ground. How does this happen? Donald Broadbent is a psychologist who studied listening and perception. He had subjects do a dichotic listening task, meaning he put headphones on them and he fed different kinds of information into each ear. What he found is that the subjects could pay attention only to one input. So the input in one ear is what they would remember and they could speak out. The other one they ignored. So according to Broadbent, he said we had a filter in our brain. So we had input coming in from our ears or wherever since we have it, and there was something in our brain that filtered what we were going to pay attention to. So we would filter one or the other, and whatever we decided to pay attention to, that would go into our short-term memory. This model works pretty good when we start looking at some aspects of selective attention. We've talked before about inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is when we're walking down the road, talking on the phone, something happens around us, and we are totally oblivious to whatever that is, because we are so focused on the conversation on the phone that we miss those other things going on around us. We also saw this in the selective attention task with the gorilla. About half of the people counting the basketball passes in our gorilla video early in class missed the fact that the gorilla walked through, because we were paying attention to the passes for the people in the white shirts. And so when the gorilla walked through, we were totally blind to that aspect of our attention. Change blindness is another aspect that's kind of funny, and we will see that in a video here later on. But basically, what happens is people will be so focused on one thing, something can change drastically and they won't even notice it. We'll notice that in a video when somebody is talking to somebody to get directions. Somebody carries a big piece of board in between them, and the person they're giving directions to actually changes, and the person does not even notice. So that's an example of change blindness. We focused our attention in giving our directions to that person, and we don't even notice when the person changes. Those two things support the filter model of selective attention. However, there is another effect that kind of throws some doubt on the filter model. The filter model says we totally ignore the other inputs. But you all would be aware of something called the cocktail party effect. Say you're sitting there talking to somebody and you're holding a conversation, you're totally paying attention to the person you're having the conversation with, and somebody in a distant group speaks your name. That automatically comes into your senses and you automatically perk up and pay attention to your name. That's the cocktail party effect. So if that other input was totally filtered out, you would not be able to attend to your name. So there must be something else going on to take into account the cocktail party effect. And Treisman looked at that and decided that we actually had something more attuned to the attenuation model. Attenuation means weakening. So according to Treisman, we listened with both ears and we buffered out part of that sound. So one thing we paid attention to, and that went through to our short-term memory. The other thing we actually heard, but it went through a bottleneck. So it was a weakened signal. If we needed to pay attention to it, we can pick it back up because it was there. It's just that we weren't fully paying attention to it. Now, it's not just the sensation from the outside that determines our perception. Things in our memory are also going to make a big difference in what we're going to perceive. What we expect to see, we often see. Take, for instance, someone's gender. We tend to know what a male looks like and what a female looks like. Well, what happens if a person doesn't quite match what we think a male or female should look like? Take, for instance, this picture. In general, we think that somebody with short hair and features similar to this person might be a male, but then again, we look and this person has lipstick on, maybe some eye makeup on, and maybe is wearing some clothes that may or may not be male or female. So again, when we look a second time, we have to consider some of those things to determine whether this person matches the image we have for gender in our brain. We have those mental models for lots of things in our brain. For instance, say you went into a library and you wanted the assistance of a librarian. Which of these people would you go to? Again, many of us have a mental model for a librarian, but we could easily walk up to the wrong person and say, oh, just because this person is wearing glasses, is carrying books, and looks pretty matronly, she must be the librarian. Well, it's very likely the other girl could be a librarian as well. She might not keep her job if she went to work like that, but she easily could be a librarian. What you see is not always what you get. Our brain is enclosed in this big black box we call a skull. So the only way it can make sense of the world is through our senses. And it's got to interpret what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we feel. I have a short video from Discovering Psychology, the PBS series, with Dr. Philip Zimbardo. He's going to talk about how we make sense of reality.
Our sensory knowledge of these stimuli comes from the many millions of specialized receptors spread throughout our bodies. In our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, muscles, our joints and tendons, our inner ear, and even certain parts of our digestive tract. Each receptor is designed to detect certain types of physical energy, such as light waves or sound waves. This stimulation is then converted into a special code, electrochemical signals called neural impulses, which the nervous system transmits to the brain's cortex. The cortex has the job of putting all the sensory information together and acting upon it. Different regions of the cortex translate different neural impulses into different psychological experiences, such as melody or touch. Visual information is first processed in the occipital lobe area in the rear of the brain, hearing and smell in the temporal lobe, speech perception in the frontal lobe, and body senses in the parietal lobe. These primary sensory centers then project the results of their activity to a relay station, the thalamus, which in turn sends the information to a succession of areas in the cortex. It's believed that this is where more abstract information processing takes place, and where we connect new information with old information stored in our memory. Visual perception, for instance, takes place in three areas: in the retina, or the back surface of the eye, in the pathways through the brain, and in the part of the cortex at the back of the brain responsible for visual processing, the visual cortex. This is the way an image, or rather a pattern of stimulation, is formed on the retina. It's upside down, flat, distorted, full of holes, out of focus, and obscured by blood vessels. In fact, it's amazing that we see as well as we do. Now remember that the task of all perception is to determine what the real object in the environment is. Another term for this object is the distal stimulus, the thing out there. But the only way to find out what that is by using information derived from the object's stimulation of a sensory receptor in the body. This stimulation is called the proximal stimulus. In this case, an image formed on the retina. The brain knows only the image, but what it must discover is the true nature of the actual object, the distal stimulus. So here's where the brain earns its keep. It must eliminate confusing signals, fill in the blanks, give it 3 dimensions, and straighten out the upside-down image to put it all in perspective. These transformations occur instantly and continually.
One way we make sense of the world is by seeing the world as consistent. An example of this perceptual constancy is the Ames illusion. This video from Scientific American Instant Egghead tells us what the Ames illusion is.
Does what we see correspond to what's really out there? Or does our brain construct its own version of reality, one that does not always match up with the physical universe? Check me out, for example. I am the same size here as I am over here, but over here I look much larger. No, it's not a cheap video trick. It's a trick on your brain. Here's what you're seeing. The me over here is indeed projecting a smaller image onto your retina, the region of light detecting cells at the back of your eye. All else being equal, smaller images mean smaller things. Here, I'm in no danger of hitting my head on the ceiling. But over here, I am ducking. Ceilings are useful visual landmarks for judging size. Of course, you're making these size estimates based on the assumption that this room is ordinary and box-shaped. You assume the back wall is perpendicular to the line of sight, so the two versions of me are the same distance away. You're also assuming that the floor and ceiling are level and parallel. But as you probably guessed, this isn't the case, and the room isn't box-shaped at all. It's trapezoidal. The back left corner of the room is much farther away than the right. Since I'm farther away over here, my image is smaller, although I'm definitely not. The ceiling cue is also misleading. The floor actually slants upward and the ceiling downward from left to right, making my head much closer to the ceiling when I'm over here. Why couldn't you see these things and adjust your size estimates? the room's features have been cleverly distorted to be consistent with a rectangular shape. The checkerboard pattern on the floor gets finer grained toward the right, so that the same number of pattern elements fit in a shorter distance. The windows are resized and shaped to match the trapezoidal back wall. Your narrow angle of view from the front of the room blocks the cues that would reveal the room's true shape. And of course, we easily believe in a box shape because that's the shape rooms normally are. This clever setup is called the Ames illusion. American ophthalmologist Adelbert Ames Jr. devised it in 1934 and built a physical example the following year. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Ingrid Wickelgren.
But what happens when we realize the world doesn't quite make sense? Our perceptions can adapt to our sensations. Perceptual adaptation will be shown in the next video when we look at how a quarterback adjusts when his sensations are distorted. This video comes from Discovering Psychology with Dr. Philip Zimbardo again.
When a quarterback sees a receiver, for instance, he automatically, unconsciously calculates distance, angle, and velocity, and the muscles in his hand, arm, and shoulder adjust accordingly. But what if we distort his perception of the receiver? These glasses will displace his visual field by 20 degrees. In other words, the distal stimulus, the real object, will be 20 degrees off from where he perceives it to be. If he continues to pass with the glasses on, he'll begin to adapt to the new signals by compensating for the misinformation his retina is sending to his brain. He'll start throwing what seems to him to be 20 degrees off in order to hit the receiver. He has quickly learned a new arm-eye coordination. But return his vision to normal, and he'll start missing again, in the opposite direction. Even though his retina is now passing on accurate information about the true location of the target, his brain hasn't caught up with the new input. His brain is still compensating for the previous feedback from the movements in his hand and arm. Getting accurate information about the world around us, and not just the images on a retina, is the major task of our visual system. But to sense, perceive, and understand our world, we utilize two very different processes. First, our sensory receptors detect external stimulation and send this raw data to the brain for analysis. We call this bottom-up processing. Then top-down processing enters the scene. It adds what we already know about such stimulation, what we remember about the context in which it usually appears, and how we label and classify it. In this way, we give meaning to our perceptions. When people walk towards us, we know that they're not getting larger, even though the image they cast on the retina does get larger. And if a shadow falls on our newspaper, we know the paper isn't turning darker. That's because the hallmark of perception is our ability to impose stability on the constantly changing flow of sensations we experience. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as perceptual constancy. The actual size, shape, orientation, and brightness of an object are perceived as remaining relatively constant, even when there are extreme variations in the image it projects.